Two potential cyber attacks now look like glitches instead. Gray Energy and Zebrocy look as though they're close enough to be, if not the same threat actor, at least first cousins. The U.S. Army pushes significant cyber capability to a tactical level. Venezuela's crisis may provide the next occasion for Russian information operations. We'll look at how Bellingcat exposes info operations. Special counsel Mueller secures the indictment and arrest of Roger Stone. Author P.W. Singer joins us to discuss his book Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media. And leave the nest alone. And now a word from our sponsor, KnowBe4. You know, email is still the #1 attack vector the bad guys use, with a whopping 91% of cyber attacks beginning with phishing. But email hacking is much more than phishing and launching malware. Find out how to protect your organization in an on-demand webinar by Roger A. Grimes, KnowBe4's data-driven defense evangelist. Roger walks you through 10 incredible ways you can be hacked by email and how to stop the bad guys. And he also shares a hacking demo by KnowBe4's Chief Hacking Officer, Kevin Mitnick. So check out the 10 incredible ways and learn how silent malware launch, remote password hash capture, and rogue rules work, why rogue documents, establishing fake relationships, and compromising a user's ethics are so effective, details behind clickjacking and web beacons, and how to defend against all of these. Go to knowbe4.com/10 ways to watch the webinar. That's knowbe4.com/1 and 0 WAYS, and we thank KnowBe4 for sponsoring our show. From the CyberWire studios at Data Tribe, I'm Dave Bittner with your CyberWire summary for Friday, January 25th, 2019. Two apparent, or at least potential, cyber attacks or government actions that surfaced this week now appear to be the result of technical glitches. In what's by far the larger of the two, Microsoft's Bing search engine was blocked in China yesterday, which prompted speculation in many quarters that this amounted to another brick in the Great Firewall, a riposte in a sharpening Sino-American trade war, and so on. But Bloomberg reports that service has been restored and that the outage was due to a technical mistake. Redmond itself has been quiet about the incident, saying only that service was back and that such things do happen. The second incident, a widespread outage of the criminal justice secure email, widely used by barristers in Wales and England, has now been determined by the Ministry of Justice to have been an accident, a glitch, and not the result of a cyber attack. The system went down a week ago, and a number of trials have been delayed. Full restoration is expected next week, but the system has of today partially recovered. Kaspersky reports that Russian threat actors Gray Energy and Zebrocy, one of the GRU group Fancy Bear's paws, share tools and techniques. Gray Energy is generally regarded as the successor to Black Energy, best known for its role in attacks that took down geographically confined but still significant sections of Ukraine's power grid. Zebrocy, seen as an avatar of Sophisy, has mostly been active in government networks around Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Kaspersky has found that the groups use the same servers at the same times and serviced some of the same targets. The story is an interesting one in that it illustrates some of the difficulty in fixing the identity of threat actors, even after one has glimpsed them. It's not quite metaphysics, except insofar as org charts have a metaphysical tendency, but it does suggest again that attribution and tracking of threat actors is a complicated matter. Military cyber operational capabilities are fast developing into tactical realities. The U.S. Army is establishing two organizations built around the 17th and 41st Field Artillery Brigades to, as Breaking Defense puts it, hack, jam, sense, and shoot. Hacking and jamming increasingly go together as cyber operations and electronic warfare continue to converge. Sensing is a natural and necessary for both electronic and kinetic attack. The shooting would be done for the most part by rockets, specifically HIMARS high-mobility artillery rocket systems. The hacking and jamming would be the work of battalion-strength intelligence, information, cyber, electronic warfare, and space detachments, one per brigade, inevitably to be known by their acronym I2CEWS. The organizations are a serious sign that the U.S., at least, is prepared to delegate significant cyber capability down to surprisingly low tactical levels. One of the new detachments is now operational with the 17th Field Artillery Brigade at Combined Base Lewis McChord in Washington State. The other is destined for the 41st Field Artillery Brigade, formerly the Babenhausen, but now re-established at Grafenwehr, Germany. These are by no means the national assets one usually thinks of when considering cyber capabilities. And when you get to Graf, cyber warriors, bring your galoshes. The mud there is famous. Since information campaigns can be expected to follow great power and regional tensions, watch Venezuela. Russia has warned the U.S. against military intervention in the failed Chavista state, NBC News reports. Venezuela is Russia's strategic partner, Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov said, and deposition of President Maduro, quote, would shake the foundations of the development model which we see in Latin America, end quote. The U.S., joined by the UK and others, has expressed strong support for opposition leader Juan Guaido's constitutional claim to an acting presidency. The U.S. has expressed its intention to put as much diplomatic and economic pressure as it can on President Maduro's regime, widely regarded as having retained power fraudulently. There's little evidence of interest in Washington's part on military intervention, but Moscow squints and says it can see it. It's striking that Russian statements find much to praise in Venezuela's development model. Bellingcat seems to have had success in countering Moscow's and others' information operations. Foreign Policy interviews the citizen journalists who got their initial funding through a Kickstarter campaign and discusses how they were able to geolocate ISIS demonstrators, expose the GRU agents behind the Novichok attacks in Salisbury, and point out that alleged gun camera footage showing U.S. atrocities in the Middle East was actually just screenshots from a first-person shooter game. Bellingcat has done some very nice work with open-source intelligence, and their founder, Elliot Higgins, points out the core challenge of anyone involved in such work. Higgins says, quote, getting a balance between being obsessive enough and not also crazy is rather difficult, end quote. It can also be difficult to get open-source intelligence, OSINT, taken seriously, since there's a perennial temptation among many, and intelligence professionals are no different, to confuse cost with value, and OSINT can be a bargain. Microsoft President Bradley Smith is again urging the U.S. to publicly adhere to the Paris call for norms with respect to conduct in cyberspace. If official statements from Paris and Lille over the last week and a half are any indication, the Paris call may be more operationally supple than the earnest executives from Redmond may wish. The FBI arrested Roger Stone, former advisor to U.S. President Trump in Florida early this morning, pursuant to an indictment obtained by Special Counsel Robert Mueller. Mr. Stone has been charged with 7 process crimes, including obstruction of an official proceeding, witness tampering, and 5 counts of making false statements. The indictment doesn't allege that he conspired with WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, or others, as the president notes, but rather that he was not candid about his interest in learning about whatever dirt they may have had on the Clinton campaign. Finally, a person who goes by the nom de hack SideFX, that's side effects spelled SYDEFX, has been using credential stuffing attacks to take over Nest home security systems. He's asked his victims, or rather, as Mr. Effects would put it, since he sees himself as a white hat, those he's helping to realize that their systems aren't so secure, to subscribe to, wait for it, PewDiePie on the YouTube. Again with the PewDiePie. Mr. Effects told Motherboard he's been doing this so he can land a job as an ethical hacker and presumably to provide a public benefit. Kids, look, if you want to be an ethical hacker, start with the ethical part. That little inner Jiminy Cricket will probably tell you, not to force your way into uncooperating systems, or to scare them by talking to them through their home monitors. And now, a word from our sponsor, Coalfire. When organizations stand up new services or move existing applications to the cloud, they need to coordinate IT security efforts with business units and partners. So the question arises, is security the cloud platform provider's responsibility, or is it the customer's responsibility? To answer that data security question, you must clearly articulate who owns what, identify security gaps, and determine who will close those gaps. With the High Trust Shared Responsibility Program, there's now a clear path to address the misunderstandings, risks, and complexities when partnering with cloud service providers. Coalfire has delivered hundreds of high-trust CSF certifications since 2011, and they help organizations clarify the roles and responsibilities of security controls that protect information. They've certified the leading global cloud service providers and can help you migrate data to the cloud securely. Find out more from Coalfire, the High Trust Cloud Assessor, at coalfire.com/hightrust. That's coalfire.com/HITRUST. And we thank Coalfire for sponsoring our show. And joining me once again is Dr. Charles Clancy. He's the director of the Hume Center for National Security and Technology at Virginia Tech. Dr. Clancy, welcome back. I saw some stories pop up, a little bit of controversy here about AT&T announcing that, I guess more of a marketing campaign than anything else. So they're releasing some technology, some upgrades to their network that they're calling 5G Evolution. It's caused some folks to raise some eyebrows here. Can you shed some light on it? What's going on here?
Sure. In fact, notably, T-Mobile released a video on Twitter showing taking a sticker that said 9G and putting it in the upper corner of one of their phones as a jab at AT&T's right. 5G evolution.
Yeah.
So anytime there's a new generation of cell phone technology, there's a big marketing campaign to try and each carrier trying to outflank each other in the media. We saw the same thing with the transition from 3G to 4G, where you had commercials for both AT&T and Verizon, both indicating they offered the nation's strongest or fastest or most coverage at 4G. And at the time, Verizon had upgraded their 3G network to make it have speeds approaching 4G. Meanwhile, AT&T had begun deploying actual LTE technology, and that's why we have the differentiation between 4G and 4G LTE. Essentially, we're seeing the same thing now with 5G. 5G is there's an actual standard. It's called New Radio. So 5G New Radio is the actual signaling format. It's about 50% faster than the 4G signaling, but you can still use the same 4G signaling, but with many of the features of 5G, where you would basically be able to band together multiple chunks of spectrum in order to get the data rates higher. So essentially, what AT&T is offering is under pristine conditions, you could see 5G speeds on this network, but it's really all built out of 4G building blocks.
I see. And so the notion here is that we'll start seeing some phones that have that 5G logo up in the corner, despite the fact that the underpinnings are still going to be 4G technology?
So that's a good question. In fact, the carriers last time around went to the ITU, which is part of the UN, and actually had the definition of 4G changed so that they could legally call it 4G. We actually saw the same thing with 3G technology, where GSM Edge service was reclassified as a 3G technology, even though it was based on 2G. And it was specifically to try and meet those marketing criteria. And the ITU actually sets these thresholds. So it'll be interesting to see if the ITU is willing to call this 5G and whether this is something that then becomes more ubiquitous. But it's all really part of this incremental change and upgrade of technologies that ultimately is going to lead to nationwide 5G.
Yeah. So buyer beware. Just make sure what you think you're getting is what you're actually going to be getting out there.
And keep in mind that right now there is no production 5G service. There's a lot of trials underway, and I expect that within the first half of 2019 we'll start to see real 5G commercial service, but it's not quite there yet.
All right, Dr. Charles Clancy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Now I'd like to share some words about our sponsor, Cylance. AI stands for artificial intelligence, of course, but nowadays it also means all image or anthropomorphized incredibly. There's a serious reality under the hype, but it can be difficult to see through to it. As the experts at Cylance will tell you, AI isn't a self-aware Skynet ready to send in the Terminators. It's a tool that trains on data to develop useful algorithms. And like all tools, it can be used for good or evil. If you'd like to learn more about how AI is being weaponized and what you can do about it, visit threatvector.cylance.com and check out their report, Security Using AI for Evil. That's threatvector.cylance.com. We're happy to say that their products protect our systems here at the CyberWire, and we thank Cylance for sponsoring our show. My guest today is Peter W. Singer. He's a strategist at New America and author of the book Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media, along with his co-author Emerson Booking. Mr. Singer is author of a number of books on both conventional and cyber warfare, and was named one of the top 100 most influential people in defense issues by Defense News. He joined us from his office in Washington, D.C.
So we started this project almost 5 years ago, and there was a series of seemingly, kind of new breakpoints, but actually now in retrospect, they signified a new normal. And they were everything from, for example, you had the first, what was called Twitter war, that played out where Israel and Hamas had one of their sort of regular conflicts, and there was a series of days of airstrikes and the like, and it kind of ended inconclusively on the ground. But alongside it, for the first time, you had these online, what we now call battles, but basically debates going back and forth as to what was happening, literally millions of messages. And what was interesting about it was not just that you had these messages going back and forth, but that the vast majority of the messages claiming what was happening on the ground, who was in the right and wrong, were being pushed by people physically outside the region. And what was even more notable than the fact that, you could, for example, weigh in on this conflict, even though you might be, checking Twitter on the subway on the way to work, is that actually the ebb and flow of the conflict had real world consequences. They later found that essentially whichever side was winning, so to speak, in the trends online, it shaped the both pace and location of the airstrikes by over 50%. What was essentially happening is that the Israeli generals and politicians were watching the maps, but also watching their Twitter feed, which now, of course, seems normal. Another example about 5 years back was we had a group of terrorists seize a shopping mall in Kenya, and the government tried to shut down communication and reporting about what was happening. And the result was that the terrorists who were on social media became the primary source for the world on their act of terrorism. So actually we fed into the very goal of terrorism, which is, to drive the message and it's to drive fear viral. But what was, again, interesting is the terrorists realized that because they own the narrative, they also didn't have to tell the truth online. Again, sort of a seemingly obvious realization, but this is where we're at. And then finally, you had a policy change in the U.S. military, which allowed deploying service members to Afghanistan to use Facebook and Twitter. And so for the first time, you had people in the battlefield able to friend their enemy. And in turn, their enemy, the Taliban, could not just friend and stalk and track and communicate with them, but could equally reach out and connect to, everything from family members, friends, journalists back home, you name it. And so you had this kind of connection point. And so all of these things were a spark for us to start the book project. And then we started to explore essentially how social media was being used in war zones around the world. But very quickly that widened. If you're looking at, for instance, Iraq and Syria, the rise of ISIS, it becomes a story of terrorism. If you're looking at terrorism, you have a cross with things like the drug war in Mexico, and we started to look at how drug cartels were using it. Then we began to look at, Chicago gangs. If you're looking at how it was used in places like Russia and Ukraine, very quickly it moved into American domestic politics. And so the project was essentially trying to explore just what's going on here in this new form of online online conflict that, as we talk about it, is not about hacking of computers on the network, sort of the classic definition of cyber war, but rather hacking the people on social networks by driving ideas viral, what we call a like war.
There's no shortage of, breathless reporting and headlines that these networks are going to be the end of us. It's going to lead to the downfall of democracy, and, the way we communicate and our freedoms are at risk. Do you think that there's something to that? I guess what I'm getting at is, how accurate do you think those warnings are? How concerned should we be as we head forward?
It's a technology that can be used for massive good and massive evil. Guess what? Like every other technology in the past. So if you think of, for instance, the radio, Goebbels talked about how his rough quote was, this is talking about the rise of the Nazi Party. The top propagandist of it said, we couldn't have done it without the radio. Of course, the radio also allowed FDR's famous fireside chats that mobilized the free world against the Nazis. The radio also created new forms of shared entertainment. So we've been through these kind of, sea changes before. What we need to recognize is social media is on that level. And we've seen it empower new actors who've used it for evil and for good. A couple of things, though, that are important about that. The first is, I think right now we feel so negative about it, largely because of how positive we felt about it just a couple years ago. Just a couple of years ago, there was this just crazy level of techno optimism. It was everything from the Arab Spring and, social media has a, quote, liberating power and, dictatorships are on their way out, to, Facebook has a motto that it's pushing out, that back then it's meant as a positive. Now it feels kind of creepy, where they're pushing, quote, the more we connect, the better it gets. Now think about that, now how that sounds. No, the more we connect, the more we connect. And, we've seen the good and the bad of it. But you had this kind of crazy level of techno optimism. And now we're feeling sort of the second side of it. The other aspect is that essentially part of why it feels so bad is that we've not understood these new rules of the game. And so, essentially the bad actors, whether it's, Russian disinformation warriors to trolls, and conspiracy theorists, they've been the ones that have understood these rules. And so they've been manipulating their way into a level of success that they wouldn't have otherwise achieved. And so it's up to us to learn these new rules, to be able to push back against it. And that's what the book project was about, is trying to help us all understand, what are these rules of the game.
That's Peter W. Singer. He's author of the book Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media, along with his co-author, Emerson Brooking. There is a lot more to our conversation. You can find it over on our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/thecyberwire. And that's the CyberWire. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making the CyberWire possible, especially our supporting sponsor, Observit, the leading insider threat management platform. Learn more at observit.com. Don't forget to check out the Grumpy Old Geeks podcast, where I contribute to a regular segment called Security Ha. I join Jason and Brian on their show for a lively discussion of the latest security news every week. You can find Grumpy Old Geeks where all the fine podcasts are listed. And check out the Recorded Future podcast, which I also host. The subject there is threat intelligence, and every week we talk to interesting people about timely cybersecurity topics. That's at recordedfuture.com/podcast. The CyberWire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of Data Tribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technology. Our CyberWire editor is John Petrick, social media editor Jennifer Iben, technical editor Chris Russell, executive editor Peter Kilpie, and I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening.